The founder of Wallbuilders, David Barton, was with us today, him and his wife, Cheryl. So give a warm Calvary Chapel welcome to Mr. Dave Barton.
Thanks, bro. Thanks, Jason. It is good to be with you guys. I want to start this morning by going to a report that came out recently. The report is from the American Bible Society. They call it the State of the Bible Report. And every year they do this. And what you see this year when we look at how people read the Bible in America, or actually how many people do it, if you look on the right side, see the blue up top? And see on the right side, it just takes a nosedive. And see on the right side, that yellow is way down at the bottom. What we found is that last year alone, we lost 26 million Bible readers in America. So those who read the Bible has taken a nosedive. It's already been low anyway, but it's taken a real nosedive. Now, here's the interesting part of the study. How do you define a Bible reader? How does the American Bible Society define a Bible reader? They define a Bible reader as someone who reads the Bible outside of church at least 4 times a year. Ooh, that's not much Bible reading. But we lost 26 million that even read it even that little. So the numbers have gone down a lot. There's a verse that Jesus gives us in Matthew 4. Jesus says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Just as you have to feed your physical body, you have to feed your spiritual body. We're really good at feeding our physical bodies. No question about that. If we fed our spiritual body, let me go the other way around. If we took spiritual meals in the same way that we took physical meals to be really healthy, but if we only took our physical meals when we took our spiritual meals, most Americans would be dead. I mean, they wouldn't have enough sustenance to live if we only ate physical meals when we literally eat spiritual meals. So we're at a point where we got to get back into Bible reading. And so one of the things I would challenge you to do, based not only what's out there, but just on Bible, what we're going to cover this morning, is let me urge you to become a daily Bible reader. Figure out a way to read some of the Bible every day. And there's apps that'll help do that. It's not a hard thing to do. You just have to prioritize and make it important in your mind. But I'll go a step further. If you already read the Bible every day, let me encourage you to memorize at least a Bible verse a week. Now, that's not much, but hiding His word in your heart. It's not reading in His mind. He says, "Thy word have I hidden in my heart that I might not sin against thee." We're also told in 1 Timothy 4:15 that if you meditate on these things, your change, your improvement will appear to all. Being a cowboy from the country, having a ranch in Texas, we know what it is when a cow chews its cud. It's digesting its food. That's where it gets the nutrients. That's what memorization does. It's hiding something in your heart that you can bring back up later, and you can get some nourishment out of it, some digestion. You can chew on it for a while. You can think about it. You can meditate on it. When you read it, a lot of times that doesn't stay with you. So memorizing something, put in your heart. Now, this is something we used to do regularly in American history. I want to take you back to 1787. Back at the time when we were putting together the Constitution of the United States, the guy probably most happy about that was Benjamin Franklin. And the reason was, way back in 1754, 33 years before the Constitutional Convention, he's the first guy to call for the United States of America. He said, "Guys, we've been 13 nations forever. Let's become one nation with 13 states." And it was called the Albany Plan of Union. Now, they didn't buy into it back then, but this is his dream. And so you have in 1776, when we signed the Declaration of Independence saying, hey, let's become an independent nation. At that point in time, he's one of the 56 guys who signs that. And he's really elated because now we're starting to take that step he's always wanted. It's starting to become a nation. And then 7 years later, when we end the American War for Independence, we're victorious, we become an independent nation. He's one of only 3 guys who signs the peace treaty. He's even more elated because now we're even closer to becoming an independent nation. And then in 1787, he's there at the Constitutional Convention helping put together what he's been dreaming for since 1754, for 33 years. Now, as he's there at the Constitutional Convention, it's actually not going the way he wanted it to because he was so happy that we're there. But it turns out that all the different states, they've been nations so long, you know, each state was its own nation, that everybody came with their own agenda. So how do you do a constitution? Well, you got the New Jersey plan, you got the Connecticut plan, you got the New York plan, you got the Virginia plan, and everybody likes their own. Virginia didn't like the Connecticut plan. Connecticut didn't like the New Jersey plan. Jersey didn't like the New York plan. And so what happens is everybody's fighting and bickering. Everybody's got the way they want it done. It's got to be my way. And so the convention literally 5 to 6 weeks in starts falling apart. People like Alexander Hamilton said, bye, I've got better things to do than fight with you guys. George Mason of Virginia, he's out. He's got better things to do than bicker. At that point in time is when Franklin gives the longest speech that he gave at the Constitutional Convention. Now, this is Franklin. He's circled right here. Franklin at this point is 81 years old, and that's not particularly impressive today because the average lifespan in America is 80 years old today. He's 81. The reason that's significant is the average lifespan in America back then, the average American lifespan at that time was 33 years old. So if any of you guys are 17 years old today and you'd been alive back then, you would have already had your midlife crisis. It's half over for you. When you get 17, you're down after that. It's literally, can you imagine a time when 33 years old was the average lifespan? And here's Franklin at 81 years old. Now, every other speech he gave at the Constitutional Convention, he wrote it out, somebody else read it for him. This one, he did off the cuff. He's just passionate. His passions that come through, and he shares just off the top of his head. He gives a speech. And so interesting to see what he said. Let me read the speech to you, and you understand the situation. So things are falling apart, and this is what he said. He said, and by the way, it was Thursday, June 28, 1787. If you want to look it up in the records, that's the day he gave the speech. He said, gentlemen, he said, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we've not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Now, a little time out here. The room where they wrote the Constitution is also the room where they signed the Declaration of Independence. And 11 years earlier, when they were there, they had Congress, but it didn't have two bodies. They didn't have a House and Senate, it's just one Congress. But they've got 3 chaplains in Congress, and they prayed a lot. Matter of fact, by the time you get to 1815, you'll find that there are 1,400 government-issued calls to prayer in America by 1815. I mean, we prayed a lot. We thought it was important to pray. The government called us to pray. And so at this point, he says, guys, don't you remember what we used to do in this room? He said, we used to pray. He said, our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. He said, all of us engaged in the struggle must observe frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? He said, I've lived, sir, a long time. And yes, he had. He said, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of man. He said, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord built the house, they labor in vain that build it. He said, I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we should become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. He said, I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, point to note here, Franklin is hands down considered one of the he's absolute least religious of the founding fathers. That's a pretty religious speech for a least religious founding father. And by the way, least religious, that's a comparative term. Least is compared to what? I mean, somebody in this room this morning is the least religious one here, but that doesn't mean you're not religious. It may mean you're 99.7 when everybody else is 99.8. So Franklin is the least religious, but certainly he's not anti-religious. And by the way, here's the question I would have for you. The speech that you just saw there was 14 sentences long. So a 14-sentence long speech. Let me ask you a question. How many Bible verses did Ben Franklin just quote in that speech? Think back over it. How many can you count? Come up with the number. You should come up with 14 because these are the verses he quoted in that speech. Off the cuff, just throwing it out there, he quoted 14 Bible verses just in a passionate speech he gave. Really? How did he do that? How in the world did Franklin have all those Bible verses? Jesus tells us how. If you go back to what Jesus says in Matthew 12:34, Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What comes out your mouth is what's on the inside. What you put in here is going to come out your mouth at some point. And that's the way these Bible verses were. This is why memorization is so good. See, he wasn't reading the Bible that morning. This is stuff he had memorized. This is stuff he had put on the inside, which is why it came out the outside when he started speaking. This is why having his word hid in your heart, it comes out when you need it. You can bring it out and it brings perspective. Interesting thing about memorizing the Bible. Let me show you a couple other examples. If I take you to and by the way, before I go there, I'm going to take you to Patrick Henry. there was an interesting conversation that Ben Franklin had with Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. Samuel Cooper's a great minister back then. And Sam and Ben were talking, and Ben said, I've been diplomat in France and in England. I've been several places. He said, this is an interesting thing. When I give a speech in America, it's really different from when I give a speech in England and Europe. And this is what he told him. He says, here in America, it's not necessary that in New England, so New England part, northern states, where everybody reads the Bible and is acquainted with Scripture, it's not necessary that I should note the Bible references from which I take them. I don't have to tell people I'm quoting the Bible. He says, but I've observed that in England, as well as in France, that verses and expressions taken from the sacred writings, and not known to be such, they appear very strange and awkward to some readers. When I'm giving speeches, if I quote the Bible here in America, I don't have to tell anybody I'm quoting the Bible because everybody studies the Bible, everybody knows it. He said, but when I'm in Europe and I quote the Bible, nobody recognizes it unless it's a really, really famous Bible verse. And that's pretty much, America has now become what Europe was back then. Because now we can look at verses that he quotes and we don't recognize those verses. He didn't have to tell anybody at the Constitutional Convention he was quoting Bible verses. They all knew it. They all read it. They studied it. You're going to see in a little bit, they believed that they believed every American, not just every Christian, but every American should read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year. That was just standard stuff, and I'll show you some of that later. So Franklin talking about, hey, when I'm in France and Europe, I have to tell them quoting the Bible, but not here. So let me show you some more examples of this. Let me take to Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is known for the famous speech that he gave at St. John's Church. That's where the legislature was meeting in Richmond. And the reason they were meeting was Great Britain had started oppressing the colonies. And so they've gone into Boston and they shot people in Boston, the Boston Massacre. And they've been taking stuff out of their homes. They come to Virginia where Patrick lives, and they had what's called the gunpowder incident, where they went into private homes and stuff and took things out. British couldn't do that. By the British Bill of Rights, a man's home is his castle. That was British law. You can't go into somebody's home and take something out. You have to have a warrant, but they did. They went in the home, took stuff out. So Patrick Henry got 2,000 farmers together. They went after the 200 soldiers that took the stuff, got it all back. But Patrick Henry's seen all this. But the problem is, the mentality is we do not want to get into a war with Great Britain because we're a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and teachers. We don't have a military. They've been our military our whole life. They're the greatest military in the world. We got no chance if we have to fight them, and we just can't do it. So regardless of what they do, we just got to let it ride. And that was the mentality. That was the mentality of the Virginia legislature. What do? We don't have any ability to do anything else. There's nothing we can do. We're just not strong enough. This is when Patrick Henry gave his speech. He challenged them on that thinking, and this is what he told them. He says, "Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means which the God of nature has placed in our power. The millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can raise against us." He says, "Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. The war's actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms." He was a prophet because shortly after this, they got the word that Lexington, Concord, and the road to Boston have all been attacked. Shortly after this, the next gale that came from the north brought to them the clash of resounding arms. He said, "Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of change and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Now, we studied the last part of that. Give me liberty, give me death. But we don't really look at the first part. But same question. He had a speech there that's 14 sentences. Question is, how many Bible verses did he just quote? There are 11 Bible verses he quoted there. You can look up the references and you'll see, hey, he just said that. Yeah, he did. He just, again, where did it come from? It's inside. He's given this passion speech. It's just what comes out. What's on the inside comes to the outside. You also have George Washington, when he's elected president in 1789, the only unanimous vote for president ever in the United States. Every single electoral vote went to him. There was no contest on it. He's the favorite guy. And he says, we have been 13 nations for so long. Now we're one nation. I need to go to all the different states and help them understand they're part of the nation. And so that's part of what he does. After inauguration, he starts traveling to the various states. And in 1790, he's going in the state of Rhode Island. And as he's going into Rhode Island, the people in Rhode Island here, Georgia's going to be here. And so there's a Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, that writes him a letter and says, we so thank God has raised you up. I mean, what you've done for religious liberty, what you've done for our civil, our political freedom, what you've done for the spiritual character of the nation. And they just praise him and say, we are so looking forward to you being here. We just so love what you've done. And so Washington writes back a fairly short letter. It's, well, thank you for your letter. And he gives this reply back. And in 2 sentences, look at these 2 sentences. He tells them, he says, may the children of the stock of Abraham, the Jewish people, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all, in our several vocations, useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. Same question, 2 sentences. How many verses did he quote? 10. There's 10 verses he just quoted. These are the verses. And again, if you look them up, you say, yeah, that's exactly what he said. It's exactly. So again, this is hiding his word in our hearts, hiding God's word in our hearts. That's what was done back then. And that's what really shows up with speeches like that. And I can show you so many other speeches. In the summertime, we do sessions, 1-week sessions for 18 to 25-year-olds that are going into college, because we know it's been taught in college. I've been appointed in a number of states by state boards of education, do history and social studies standards in those states. We own 160,000 original items out of American history, from the time of Columbus to the Bible that landed on the moon with Apollo 14. I mean, we got all this stuff. So when we get these young people in, we let them handle all that and see all that, because we know what they're about to be taught. And it's interesting that this aspect of seeing the Bible verses and seeing what's there. We take an 1753 letter that Ben Franklin's writing to another person and just say, okay, there's a letter. It's short, just a few paragraphs. Find how many verses are in there. And everybody's got to go through and see what the verses are. And it's just amazing. They're just shocked at how many, sometimes dozens of verses are in these letters, and we just don't recognize anymore because we're not that familiar with the Bible's teachings. We're familiar with what the Bible generally says and need for salvation in Christ, but when it comes to specific phrases and words, that's not part of what we really understand anymore. And so that's what stands out about. Now, that's why I would encourage you to read the Bible every day, get that word in your heart, but also hide some in your heart. Psalm 119, verses 9 through 11, and that's by memorizing a Bible verse just once a week. An easy thing. It'll take you a good 3 to 4 minutes to memorize a Bible verse. It's not that long. You just keep repeating it to yourself throughout the week until you get it hidden in there fully. That come back whenever you need it. Now, let me shift to where we are as a people in some other areas. There's a great verse in Proverbs 10:22 that says, the blessing of the Lord, it makes rich, and he adds no sorrow to it. Now, what you find is God's blessing is something that enriches our life, but I really learned a lot about blessings by reading the writings of Benjamin Rush. Out of all the 250 folks we call founding fathers, John Adams said that the 3 most notable founding fathers are George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, for whatever reason, we don't know much about him today because he is way too Christian for most folks to talk about in textbooks as far as academics and et cetera. The guy started the first Bible Society in America. He started the Sunday School movement in America. He started the first Abolition Society in America. He started 5 universities. 3 of them still go today. He started the first academic education for women. He served in 3 different presidential administrations. He started the first training for black physicians. He's the first professor of chemistry. He wrote the first chemistry textbook, wrote the first psychiatry textbook. He's called the father of modern psychiatry. He's the greatest doctor in American history, called the father of American medicine. I just keep going. The guy is absolutely amazing. We have a lot of his original writings. I have his prayer journal, and he's a strong Christian and reading through the Bible. He'll keep his notes, and it's kind of like a concordance. Here's all the Bible verses, what God says about animals, or here's what God says about prisons, or whatever. He just keeps topics, and he's just looking for what God says on every topic. And it's interesting that in reading his memoirs and reading his various things, as a good Christian, he's trying to be very thankful to God for all the blessings he enjoys. And he goes through all the things we would think about. And then he came to one that just really got me. He said, I thank God for all the times I have not fallen downstairs. Run that by me again. I just ran up the stairs and nobody noticed it. If I'd fallen, you would have noticed it. That wouldn't have been a blessing. See, we do things all the time that we don't notice it because nothing goes wrong, like having your health until something happens, or having your family until something happens, or having a job until something. The things that are really blessings in our life, a lot of times you never notice. The things that are the biggest blessings are the things we often notice the least. And that thing about walking upstairs and not falling down, I thought, that's a great point. And we're surrounded, particularly as Americans. I think in Americans, we are unaware of the blessings we really enjoy. And let me kind of point some out. If I take you to the Constitution, we've had 5,800 years of recorded history in the world. There have been thousands of nations, thousands of governments. Do you know what the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is? Thousands of nations, thousands of governments, thousands of years. The average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. Last September the 17th, on Constitution Day, when the Founding Fathers signed the Constitution in 1787, we've celebrated 234 years since then. Nobody's ever come close to that number. We take our stability and we just kind of think it's normal, because that's all we've enjoyed is stability, and we just kind of assume that's the way it is because we don't know anything else. We look at Ukraine and say, isn't it tragic what's happening in Ukraine? Yes, it is tragic, but what's happening in Ukraine is normal. The average nation experiences a violent revolution every generation and a new constitution every 17 years. 7 years ago, when Putin invaded Crimea, before he invaded Belarus this time, he invaded Crimea 7 years ago, I was asked to go over to Ukraine and help them write a new constitution. Guys, you had one in 1992. Yeah, but it's all old and out of date. See, we've had a constitution that has been timeless. It has transcended all that. We don't go through the stuff that the rest of the world goes through, and we just take that for granted. We think that's kind of normal. Same thing happens when you look not only to our longevity, but also to our creativity. America is only 4% of the world's population. We're a small nation. 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. Our 4% of the world's population has produced more than 96% of the inventions, cures, and discovery in the world. Our 4%, we have more medical technology, more cures, more scientific stuff, more entertainment stuff, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. We're surrounded with stuff that people all over the world would love to have, and we just take it for granted because we have it every day. We see it every day, even with our prosperity. Every year we come out with our 4% being, we provide 23, 24, 25% of the world's gross domestic product every year. That translates into economic benefit for all of us. Here's how. When you look at the census, the Constitution requires we do a census every 10 years. We did one in 2020. It came out in 2021, and the census numbers tell us that if you, as of right now, and this is the way it's been every decade for the last couple of centuries, if you live in poverty in America, right now, if you live in poverty, and we don't want anybody living in poverty. If you live in poverty in America right now, your lifestyle is higher than middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. So being poor in America is better than being middle class in Europe? Yeah. As a matter of fact, you'll find that right now the World Bank sets the global standard for poverty. The World Bank says if you make $1,000 a year or less, you live in poverty. 1,000? Do you know that in Hawaii and Mississippi, other states, they say, if you're not making more than $61,000 a year, you shouldn't come off government services because that's what you're going to get, government services. So the rest of the world's sitting at 1,000. We're talking 61,000 for government services, and that's the poor in America? See, again, we use terms and we don't compare it to what everybody else understands those terms to be. We compare it among ourselves, and we don't want poor in America. But even at that, we're blessed beyond every other nation in the world. So how come? I mean, what produced that? It's interesting with all the documents we have so many old textbooks from every subject for 400 years of American history. It's interesting that when you go back and look at those 400 years, textbooks routinely said, the reason America is different from all the nations is the Bible. Prove it. Well, there's lots of ways to prove it. Prove it several ways. Let me just take the way we talk to one another. The language we use when we speak to each other, we have a lot of what we call idioms. And idioms are phrases that we use in talking to one another. There's 257 idioms that we use on a daily basis that are quoting Bible verses. Most people don't recognize. As a matter of fact, if you read Shakespeare's plays, if you're into literature, Shakespeare quotes over 2,000 Bible verses in his plays. Now, he's like Franklin. He didn't tell you they're Bible verses because everybody knew it. But guys on Broadway right now do Shakespeare every weekend. There's Shakespeare. They have no clue they're quoting the Bible. I mean, the Bible is all over Shakespeare's writings. That was part of his text. And it's the same way with us, the way we speak. If you're from an older generation, these are the idioms that you hear on a regular basis. These are things that are all Bible verses. By the skin of your teeth, I'll give you my 2 cents worth. These are all Bible quotes. Every one of these phrases, there's nothing new under the sun, signs of the time, thorn in the flesh, from the cradle to the grave, hand around the wall. These are all, now that's older generation. Younger generations, these are the kind of idioms that they'll often use: eye for an eye, house divided, fight the good fight, live by the sword. All of these are direct quotes from the Bible, and you hear these on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, one of the things I love doing is as I'm driving in my pickup, I hear a radio program, I hear some advertisement, and they'll quote a Bible verse, and I'll just note it to the office. I'll send a note to the office, hey, just heard on this radio station this point in time, they quoted a Bible verse. And of course, they didn't have a clue they were doing it. And, you know, over the last 3 years, the one media source that's quoted the Bible verse more than any other source that I've heard has been ESPN. Now, ESPN has no clue. It's like, oh, LeBron, Lakers have LeBron. They're going to the promised land. Really? Well, that didn't work out too good, but they were quoting the Bible, going to the promised land. You know, they use all these Bible phrases having no clue where they came from. So next time you go to McDonald's or a gas station, or you run up Albuquerque to Home Depot or Lowe's, whatever, you're going to hear somebody use one of those. If you know the Bible, you hear them use a Bible phrase, and you really ought to stop them and say, hey, do you know what Bible verse you just quoted? Now, the fun is they won't know. The bad part is they're going to say, no, I don't know. What Bible verse was that? And you won't have a clue either. I mean, most of us don't know where the stuff came from. But every one of these, there is a verse that we can point to with every one of these, and you can see the verses and see they all, you can look those verses up, and that's where the phrase comes from. It's just part of our language now. We're at a point now where I think is well described by President John Quincy Adams. He said this, he said, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it's not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. See, we're at a point now where we've had a cultural default. If you had known those Bible verses, we'd say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you know the Bible that well. That is, we would praise you for knowing the Bible verses. Back in his day, you didn't know that was Bible? Shame on you. See, it was shameful not to know it back then. It's praiseworthy to know it. We've had a cultural shift. We've had that kind of shift over the generations where that now knowing the Bible is praiseworthy, where back then not knowing it was shameful. Another president who talks about this is Teddy Roosevelt. And for the next few minutes, I want to use presidents because you would expect me, you'd expect, you know, all of us to say good things about the Bible. That's what you expect us to say. That's why we're up here, right? These are presidents of the United States. Nobody considers them preachers and pulpiteers. And so look what Teddy Roosevelt said. Teddy Roosevelt said, the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and entwined with our civic and social life. He did not say spiritual life. He said the Bible is so much part of our civic and our social life, it would be impossible for us to figure what life would be if these teachings were removed. What's he talking about? Let's take our prosperity. We are the most prosperous nation in the world, in the history of the world at this point. And you look at that, where'd that come from? Well, there's a number of different economic systems out there. We have an economic system called the free market system, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, but it's made America the most prosperous. Now, we're at a point now where people want to get rid of it. 48% of Americans say it's time to get rid of the free market and go to socialism. 5,800 years of socialism has never produced a prosperous nation, but let's try it anyway. So we're at this point of trying to throw out the economic system. The question is, where did our economic system come from? I can show you historically. I can take you right through the records. America is the first nation in the world since the time of ancient Israel to come up with the free market system. And we did it in 5 Bible verses, and I can show you where they were applied across history. Jamestown applied 1. Jamestown applied 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Then the Pilgrims applied 1 Timothy 5:8. And as you go through, you'll see Matthew 20, Luke 19, and Matthew 25. And by the time you get to the founding fathers, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington all talk about how the Bible built our prosperous free market economic system. So if you take the free market economic system out of America, you would not recognize America anymore. We wouldn't be the same nation. See, that's a social and a political effect of the Bible. It's not necessarily a spiritual effect, but that's what Teddy Roosevelt's talking about. If you take the Bible out of America, you wouldn't even recognize our institutions. So economics, let me give you another one, our form of government. See, historically, there are 7 different forms of government. They show up in the Bible as well. We, contrary to what most Americans believe, don't have a democracy. Founding fathers hated democracy. That was one of the worst forms of government there was. That's why Article 4 of the Constitution requires that every state maintain a republican form of government. big difference between a republic and a democracy. And a republic is what the Bible talks about and it emphasizes. For example, if you look at Deuteronomy 16:18 or Deuteronomy 1:16 through 18, I said Deuteronomy 16:18, Deuteronomy 18:16, and then Deuteronomy 1:16 through 18. It's got all these things on what a republic is. Founding fathers specifically quoted Exodus 18:21, where the Bible says, "Choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Have elections and choose leaders to represent you at the local, county, state, and federal level." It says, "Choose leaders such as fear God, able men, men of truth, hating covetousness." That's a Republican form of government. We elect people to represent us. We don't all vote on everything. A democracy is a disaster. A republic is a really good thing. If you took our Republican form of government out of America, you wouldn't recognize us. Again, that's a teaching of the Bible. That was the verse cited when they created in the Constitution the fact that we're going to be a republic and not a democracy. That's an effect of the Bible. You take that away, we wouldn't be the same. So Teddy Roosevelt talks about, another president talks about is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt says, "In the formative days of the republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident." Is it really? Show me a public school textbook where it's conspicuously evident that the Bible directed the fathers of the nation. Won't find it today. Can't find it since about World War II. We had it in the 1950s, went out in 60s, 70s, 80s on through. As I mentioned, I review and write standards for states on history textbooks. It's been gone since really after World War II. He continues, he says, "We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic." Today, we read without seeing the Bible. We just assume we are who we are because we did what we did. We don't even know how we got here. But see, we used to. And it's interesting that with him saying that, I mean, I take you back to the speech or to the letter I showed you from George Washington, the speech from Patrick Henry or Ben Franklin. And by the way, they were talking about the fathers of the republic. It's been evident from the early days. Let me tell you what happened in the rest of the Constitutional Convention, because after Franklin gives this passionate appeal, guys, stop splitting everything up. Let's get together on this. As he does that, it's interesting that the records of the convention, including George Washington's diary, point out, George Washington says that after that, we took kind of a cooling off period. It's kind of like, why don't we back away and just get away from the convention a little bit, let attitudes and tempers simmer down a little. And so he says that what they did was they took 3 days off, they went to church, they listened to patriotic orations, and they came back after 3 days. Now, it's interesting that when they went to church, one of the guys at the church was the Reverend William Rogers, and he prayed over the Constitutional Convention. Everybody in Philadelphia knew this thing was falling apart because guys were leaving town and they're mad over what's happening. And so he's in church, and the Constitutional Convention is there in church and sitting right there. He's got them right there. And so he prays, and he prays a prayer for the Constitutional Convention. And it's not a dinky little prayer like we might pray to City Council, "God bless this meeting, amen." The prayer was so significant, it was printed on the front page of the newspapers. I have the newspaper from 1787 where they printed that prayer on it, and it was little bitty print, and it's 3/4 of the front page. It is a long, long prayer. It should have been a sermon. It was a long prayer. And he prayed that God would give them wisdom and take away the fighting and bickering and help them to come to unity and give them new ideas. And he just prayed and prayed and prayed. And so when they got back after the convention, delegates like Constitution signer Jonathan Dayton, he said the whole atmosphere was different when they got back. He said there was a gradual change going on. In other words, what was really a dumb idea last week is, well, I hadn't thought about it from that way. That's not as bad as I thought. And so they started making progress, and at the end of 10 weeks, they've come out with the most successful constitution in the history of the world. It almost did not happen. They take that 3-day period off, they come back, and they produce the most successful governing document in the history of the world. Now, it's interesting, as Franklin pointed out, when I'm with France and Europe, I have to tell them Bible verses. Today, there's a number of books out, one called The Godless Constitution. There's all these professors who say, oh no, the Constitution is a secular document. No. It's not. There's Bible verse after Bible verse in it, but they didn't say it was a Bible verse. And you see, when somebody today tells me that the Constitution is a secular document, what they have just done is they have told me that they are biblically illiterate. They wouldn't recognize a Bible verse if it bit them in the ankle. But I can take you into these clauses, read the language, and I'll read the Bible verse to you, and you go, that's the same language. Yes, because that was the thinking they had, and that's what happened after that 6 weeks. In the 10 weeks, they got their thinking back together, and so it's been a real evident change. It was so evident that even Andrew Jackson, who's certainly one of the least religious presidents we've had in our history, it was a no-brainer to him. He said the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. And then you have presidents like Zachary Taylor. He was a military general. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready. Zachary Taylor, look at what he said. Zachary Taylor said, the Bible is the best of books. I wish it were in the hands of everyone. It's indispensable to the safety and permanence of our institutions. He didn't say faith, he said institutions. You take the Bible out of any institution, it doesn't work as well. You take the Bible out of economics, economics don't work as well. You take the Bible out of education, you take it out of the courts, you take it out of anything, nothing works well. And that's what we're seeing now. We've become more secular since the 60s, and our institutions just aren't as efficient as they used to be, and our government's not as good as it used to be, and we've got $30 trillion in debt. Well, we've never had that before. I mean, we're doing things now that we have never even come close to doing. The more secular we become, the less our institutions work for us, and we're seeing the Justice Department is not really about justice, it's about which side wins. They're taking sides and going after certain people, not going after others, and certain people be prosecuted and others won't, and you can tear down statues and whatever, not going to have any problem with that, but if you want to have a Christian demonstration, we'll shut that down as being unconstitutional. It's just crazy to see what's happening. And that happens as we become more secular. We're not the same nation. So look in what else he said. He continues. He says, especially should the Bible be placed in the hands of the young. It is the best school book in the world. I would that all of our people were brought up under the influence of that holy book. Best school book in the world? That's why we have Christian schools today, because you can't have a Bible in schools. Yeah, I'm going to show you when that changed. We used to have Bible in schools all the way through. Christian schools today are what public schools used to be for a number of years. If you go to Ulysses S. Grant, he was in the Civil War. He was the commander of Union forces in the Civil War, became president in 1868 through 1876. In 1876 was the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In 1876, on the 100th anniversary, he put out this card. You see it says up top, it says, message of President Grant to the children and youth of the United States. What's the message he has on the 100th anniversary of the Declaration? President said, hold fast to the Bible as the sheet anchor of your liberties. This is the cornerstone of all your liberties. To the influence of this book, we're indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. If we've done it right, it's because we followed the Bible. If we didn't do it right, we weren't following the Bible. If we're going to keep doing it right in the future, we got to follow the Bible. So this is the President of the United States saying this to the young people of America. And Benjamin Rush, I mentioned him earlier, how significant he was. Benjamin Rush is called the father of public schools under the Constitution because in 1790 he came out with a piece. He said, all right, we've been 13 nations, now we're one nation. What are we going to have to be teaching in our schools if we're going to stay one nation? And he went through and talked about what we had to teach. And he said, the thing that will keep us a nation is making sure we teach the Bible in schools. And this piece came out, he gave a dozen reasons that America would never take the Bible out of schools. And he warned that if we ever come to the point that America does take the Bible out of our public schools, he said, we'll spend much more time and money fighting crime when we could have prevented crime right there in the classroom by teaching the Bible. Because what does Jesus tell us in Mark 7? All crime comes out of the heart. Look, if gun control laws, they won't do anything. Why? Because you're dealing with the heart, you're not dealing with guns. Cain was able to kill Abel by clubbing him to death. Why didn't God give us rock control laws? If we had rock control laws, we could keep people from clubbing others. It's the heart. It's not what's in your hand, it's what's in your heart. And so we understood that, we knew that, and that's what we had in that period of time. So the Bible in schools, he gives a dozen reasons, he even gives a warning. And the writings of the Founding Fathers were so clear on this that when you go to court cases, for example, there's a Supreme Court case. Oh, and by the way, I'll show you one of the quotes he has in there. He says, the great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effective means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible at schools. He said, this is what will destroy a nation. Stop reading the Bible in school. So this is public school stuff back in 1791. We had so many founders who said the same thing, that when you go to the Supreme Court in 1844 in a case called Vidal versus Girard's Executors, there was an 8-0 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court where the U.S. Supreme Court said, look, if you're going to be a government-run school that takes government funding, you will teach the Bible. We're not going to have any public school that won't teach the Bible. Unanimous decision? Yeah. And they quoted a number of founding fathers. The decision was actually even written by a guy put on the court by founding father James Madison. Joseph Story is called the father of American jurisprudence. He came out with a 3-volume commentary on the Constitution. Even today is considered the best commentary on the Constitution. And this is what he wrote on behalf of all the justices, 8-0 decision. He said, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as divine revelation in the schools? See, today we say you can have the Bible in schools if you teach it as history or literature. He said, no. It's divinely inspired. Teach it as divine revelation. This is God's word. He says, where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? 8-0 decision. I don't think we've heard about that in our history classes. What we hear about is what happened in 1962-63. 1962-63, in a series of 3 cases over a 12-month period of time. I've been involved in 13 cases. The U.S. Supreme Court was involved in one this week that the court handed down the decision. The abortion case, actually, one of the things we did in that case was we provided 412 state legislators to say, Supreme Court, leave abortion alone. Give it back to us at the states. We're the ones supposed to be doing this. This is not a federal issue. This belongs to us. And so that was the decision came down. But we've been involved in all these cases. And it's significant that when you look at the Supreme Court in that 12-month period of time, they said, we're not going to do the Bible in schools anymore. Abby Shemp, Murray Collette, Ingle Vitale, Bible's going out. Why in the world would they say the Bible has to go out of schools? Well, if you want to know, do what we did on Friday. Read the decision of the Supreme Court to see what they said. If you read the decision of the Supreme Court to see what they said about why the Bible had to come out of schools, they quoted a psychologist and they said, here's the way it is. They said if portions of the New Testament were to be read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. In other words, reading the Bible causes brain damage, psychological harm. Now, I would argue it's the other way around. I would say that we've kind of lost our brains since we've taken the Bible out of schools. I mean, we used to have a lot of common sense. For example, if you noticed a year and a half ago, the LGBTQ movement is now known as the LGBTQIA+ movement. Why is it LGBTQIA+? The plus is there because they have identified over 93 different genders. Really? Show me any mammal anywhere in any pasture around here, sheep, goats, horses, cows. How many genders are there? 2. There's not 90 some odd. We've lost our minds. And so we now are into the situation where without that biblical grounding, truth is whatever I want it to be. I can create my own truth. How do you run a nation when you do that? And that's the problem we have. Polling right now shows that 2 out of 3 Americans believe there is no absolute moral truth. Guess what? Nation will not survive. If you can't get at least 51% of the people to believe that something's wrong, you can't have any law that you enforce. And at that point in time, it becomes selective enforcement. And now we're back into what Europe was 100 years ago and what South America was 50 years ago and still even today in places in Africa. So the whole change that we see, and by the way, when the court took the Bible out in 62, 63, the court also acknowledged that we'd had prayer in schools and Bible in schools for 340 years and that we'd had it 175 years under the Constitution. They just said it's time to do something different. So that really is one of the very first bold proclamations of judicial activism in the court. They did the same thing 10 years later by saying abortion is totally legal for all 50 states. They just went through and just started changing all sorts of stuff because, again, we'd lost that biblical foundation. So going back to Dr. Rush, one of the things Benjamin Rush said in addition to that, he said the Bible, when not read in school, it's seldom read in any subsequent period of life. We now have polling that proves this. We do a lot of work with national pollsters. But a habit, if you start a habit when you're 4, 5, or 6, it'll stay with you through life. You can start that habit when you're 24, 25, 26, but you have to work harder to make it stay with you through life. You can start it when you're in 40s, but you have to work harder than when you're 20s and a lot harder than when you did it. So the later in life you do it, you can do it, but you have to work harder at it. So the sooner in life you start a habit, which we used to do with Bible reading, this is what you started in the first book you read in schools. I have the records of all the early public schools in various states. Bible is where you learn to read. You learn to read out of the Bible for 340 years in America. So Benjamin Rush talks about that. This is where biblical illiteracy today we suffer from. All of these things that are appearing on the screen right now in front of you are all things that have been in the news in the last 18 months, and that's why I chose them. But I also chose them because the Bible specifically speaks to each one of them. Really? What does the Bible say about minimum wage? Jesus has a whole parable on the minimum wage. What's it say about progressive tax or income? Bible's got a whole economic system. It says you don't do estate taxes, you don't do inheritance taxes, you do capitation taxes, you don't do progressive taxes, you don't do minimum wage. I mean, the Bible goes through there were 613 laws given to Israel that covered everything. It covered immigration, it covered economics, it covered consanguinity, criminal justice. Bible deals with all of this, and so the Bible deals with all that, but most today can't put a Bible verse beside most of those things, even rights of conscience. There's 30 verses in the New Testament alone that deal with the rights of conscience, and that's a case we have at the Supreme Court next year. The court picked up a rights of conscience case. So going back to Dr. Rush, he says, the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any other book in the world. Let me give you some quick examples historically. Let me take you to a guy named Matthew Maury. Matthew Maury, he was back in the early 1800s. So he grew up, he loved the sea, he studied the sea. When he's a young boy, he goes to sea as a cabin boy. He then became a sailor. He then became an officer. He then became a ship's captain. He then owned a fleet of ships. He just loved the sea. This was in his heart, his life, his blood. And one day he was ashore and had a stagecoach accident that crushed his leg. And his leg never healed back right, and so he wasn't able to go back to sea because he couldn't keep his balance, couldn't walk right. But he just loved the sea and he studied it. Well, he's the guy that is called the father of oceanography because he's the guy. Now, remember back in the 1830s and 40s, what kind of scientific technology do we have? Not much. And yet, back in the 1830s and 40s, he's the guy who discovered that there are jet streams in the ocean. That there are streams, there are places in the ocean where the water moves much faster than places around it. And if you doubt that, just watch Finding Nemo. It's really easy. You see the jet streams in the ocean. So those jet streams, he found these jet streams and he mapped them out. Now tell me how you map these things out without a satellite knowing where they were. And he said, guys, if you'll get over here about 4 miles, you'll get to England about 2 weeks faster than you normally would. And if you go over here to go to Australia, literally in America, to go from Boston to San Francisco, you had to go all the way around the bottom of South America. So it took you 6 months to go from Boston to San Francisco. After he came out with those maps, it cut the trip to 3 months. That's half the time. Well, if you're a commercial shipper, that means you can get twice as many trips in, you can get twice as much cargo, you can sell twice as much. This is where prosperity starts really rising, because now commercial shipping, man, you can get a lot more done and creates jobs and creates income. And so he did all that. How did he find that with that technology back then? What in the world triggered him to do that? It's interesting. He tells us himself. He said he was at home sick in bed one day, and he asked his family to read the Bible to him, and they started reading to him out of Matthew 8. And as he did, he said, well, here, just read. This is what they read to him. It says, Lord, thou madest man to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, and the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatever passes through the paths of the sea. And he said, whoa. Read that again. We just read it to you. Read it again. And he kept having them read it and reread it. And what stuck out to him was the paths of the sea. He said, I've been on the sea my whole life. I've never seen paths in the sea. Read that again. Paths in the sea. Read it again. He said, if God said there's paths in the sea, I'm going to find the paths in the sea. And that's the verse that he used to get him into the study, and that's why he's called the father of oceanography, because he found the jet streams in the ocean. But it didn't stop there. There was another verse that revolutionized his thinking. It was out of Ecclesiastes 1:6. The verse says, the wind goes toward the south and turns around toward the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. The wind has a circuit? I thought it just blew anywhere. Wind has a circuit. So he finds out one hemisphere goes one direction, another hemisphere goes the opposite direction. He figures out that there's jet streams in the air as well. And as a result of figuring out jet streams in the air, for the first time in history, weather prediction becomes possible. He's called the father of naval meteorology. He said, guys, see the way those clouds are? Don't set sail this week. Wait till next week. If you set sail this week, you're going to lose the ship. I mean, it changed everything to be able to do some weather prediction, which was so important for what was happening back then. Now, he was such a famous guy that all sorts of statues were built to him. Today, we don't know our history well enough to even know most statues who they are. He has statues built to him because he just changed the commercial world. He changed so many things. And it's interesting that when you look at the various statues, and he's got multiple statues, at the base of the statue, there's always a book right there. It says Holy Bible on the edge. We knew that's where he got all of his ideas because he wrote it all down. We used to study this. This was one of the great guys in history we studied. Another guy, John Adams. John Adams is certainly a key individual in us having survived 234 years from the Constitution. But John Adams is the guy who talked about how the separation of powers is what made us different from other nations. 3 branches of government, Isaiah 33:22, that's great. 3 branches of government, the king had 3 branches of government in England, and they didn't turn out to be a great nation. He said it was separation of powers and checks and balances that made us different. And he said, we got that out of Jeremiah 17:9. And by the way, George Washington quoted the same verse, as did James Madison, as did Alexander Hamilton. All quoted Jeremiah 17:9, which is a verse about the deceitfulness and wickedness of the heart. And that's why you have to put boundaries around and checks and balances. And so they quote that for separation of powers. That's one of the chief reasons we've survived as long as we have. You also have James Kent. He's called the father of American jurisprudence. This is one of the guys who helped set up the American judicial system. And he set it up with circuit courts. You notice we have circuits today. There's the First Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, Second Circuit, Third Circuit, Fourth Circuit, etc. They're all called circuit courts. And on top of that, each Supreme Court justice has a circuit that he's over. There's this, I think Samuel Alito's over the Fifth Circuit and whatever. Back in the day, circuit judges would get on their horses and ride a circuit. The Supreme Court justices didn't bring everybody to Washington, D.C. They got on their horses and they rode a circuit to all the various towns, and each justice did that. Why did we have circuit judges? According to James Kent, he said we did that because that's what the Bible says. He pointed to 1 Samuel 7:15 and 16, where it says, and Samuel judged Israel and rode the circuit from Gilgal to Mizpah. So here's a great judge, Samuel, and he was on a horse riding the circuit, going to various places and holding court in those places. That's why we have circuit judge. We still call them that today. Now it's all electronic. You still have circuits, but even at the state level, we have circuit courts. Ben Franklin started the first hospital in America. He started the first healthcare system in America, and he did so based on Luke 10:35. As a matter of fact, Pennsylvania Hospital he started in 1751, America's first hospital. If you walk in that hospital today, the motto is there that Ben Franklin made, the motto, and it has Luke 10:35 as the base of it. That's why we have the first healthcare system. Then you also have Alexander Hamilton, who quoted Exodus 31:18 as the reason we have a written constitution. By the way, James Madison quoted the same verse. See, we didn't have a written constitution because everybody else did, because they didn't. I mean, we'd been British for how many hundreds of years? Great Britain to this day doesn't have a constitution. They're not a constitutional country. Israel doesn't have a constitution. So many nations don't have a constitution. We did. Why did we get a constitution? Well, they tell us why, and they point to it. So there's a lot of things that they pointed to that we don't recognize today. We're just so used to it. 234 years later, we're so used to it, we don't recognize what it is. But when you look at those changes, it goes back to knowing the Bible. And the problem we have today is only 9% of Americans read the Bible on a daily basis. So we're really not familiar. We kind of know how to get saved and know about spiritual life and heaven and hell, but we don't know necessarily what to do with criminal justice stuff, or what's right and wrong with certain areas, or what kind of evidence to use, or how to confront it. Jesus talks about confronting your accuser in John 8. Matter of fact, if you study federal law, you get what's called Federal Practice and Procedure, which is about 40 volumes or however many it is of federal law. And as you get over to evidence, hearsay evidence and due process clauses, 4th through the 8th Amendment, it has 20 pages in there on how the Bible shaped the due process clauses. The right to confront your accuser comes out of John 8. Also, the right to compel witnesses in your behalf comes out of Proverbs 18:17. It says, one side sounds good until the other side is presented. That's why you get to present 2 sides every time. Media presents one side, and that's why we have the fights we have going on. We're polarized. People no longer get both sides of any argument. And so there's so much the Bible gives us. But the other part with this is, even though it's 9% of Americans Christians read the Bible on a daily basis, only 6% have a biblical worldview. So take those issues that I put up that are in the news. Only 1 in 16 Christians right now can put a Bible verse beside those issues. We have to get biblically literate again, and that's on us. That's something we can do, and that's where I'll close with President John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, I used him as the first president I talked about. John Quincy Adams, he wrote a very interesting book. It was written for his 10-year-old son. His 10-year-old son, George Washington Adams. At the time, John Quincy Adams was overseas as a diplomat. He was over in St. Petersburg, Russia. And he said, John, you're 10 years, he said, George, you're 10 years old. And so John wrote him, and he said several things. He said, number one, at 10, you should be really using a gun a lot. You should know all gun safety. At 8 years old, he had his gun out with the Massachusetts Minutemen with all the drills and the militia and the American Revolution. And he wrote his brother Thomas, he said, man, at 10 years old, make sure they know how to use pistols and rifles, gun safety. He said, I know of no gun accidents has ever occurred except by those who did not know guns and gun safety. So make sure he knows guns. So, I mean, the stuff we were teaching to young people back then. And then he says, and George, you really need to understand the Bible in a full way. So he wrote his son George 11 letters on the Bible. Here's what God tries to do in the Bible. Here's the big picture of the Bible. Here's 30,000-foot view. Here's the major doctrines in the Bible. And he does this in 11 letters. Well, people saw that and said, hey, we want that for our kids. And so it was published as a book and reprinted for generations. The letter of John Quincy Adams to his son on the Bible and his teachings. And it shows 10-year-olds how to read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year and get the most out of their Bible reading. I love going through it now. I mean, I'm no 10-year-old, obviously, but I still love all the wisdom and advice he has in there. And so this is part of what he says in there. He tells his son, George, he says, no book in the world deserves to be so unceasingly studied and so profoundly meditated on as the Bible. You just spend the most time here, think about it the most. It's deeper than you'll ever realize. He says, I myself for many years have made it a practice to read through the Bible once every year. Now, he did this when he was president of the United States. And by the way, let me show you the next one. He says, my custom is to read 4 or 5 chapters every morning, immediately after rising from bed. It employs about an hour of my time and seems to me the most suitable manner of beginning the day. Now, he served for 70 years in public life. He kept a diary for 68 years. 24 years, he never missed a day's entry on the diary. And he talks about what he studies. And so when he's president of the United States, when he's U.S. Senator, when he's a congressman, when he's a diplomat, when he's Supreme Court nominated and confirmed the U.S. Supreme Court, every morning, hour in the Bible, every morning, first thing he did. He kept up with everything else. He's one of the most brilliant attorneys ever, argued 2 Supreme Court cases, including the Amistad case. If you've ever seen the Steven Spielberg movie, Amistad, John Quincy Adams is the guy who does that. Brilliant, brilliant mind. But let me challenge you. You need to read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year. But you don't have to do what John Quincy Adams did. He said it takes an hour a day. He reads 4 chapters each day. You can read through the Bible every year with 3.2 chapters. It takes you from 10 to 12 minutes a day. He loved staying in the Bible because he kept notes and God would show him stuff and it just stimulated his thinking. If you don't read through the Bible every year, let me challenge you to start. And it's really easy to do. Today we have so many apps that help you do it. When I was getting ready to come this morning, brushing my teeth, combing my hair, I had the Bible app reading the Bible verses for the day, 10 to 12 minutes. Go through 3.2 chapters. You can get through it in a year. It's not a hard thing to do. Set aside that 10 to 15 minutes. Make a commitment to read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year. John Quincy Adams then advised George. He said, here's the way I read the Bible. Here's the way I recommend you read it. He says, I've always endeavored to read it with the same spirit which I now recommend to you. How do I read it? How should you read it? He says, with the intention and desire that it may contribute to my advance in wisdom and virtue. When I read the Bible, it's not just a spiritual devotional book. I'm not looking to get blessed. I'm looking to see what will change my thinking, what will change my actions, what will change my knowledge. I'm looking for wisdom and virtue, not just blessings and devotionals. So read it as a guidebook for all of life. Go into it with a new view, dig into it and say, what does it say about economics? And John Quincy Adams, in his writings, he says, every year when I read through the Bible, I love to take a topic I've never done before. He said, so this year I'm going to read through the Bible and look at every verse I can find about business. This year I'm going to go through the Bible and look at every verse I can find about military. And so when he would read it from cover to cover each year, he would take a different theme and see what the Bible said about that theme all the way through. So that's something we don't often do, but that's what I mean, that he's looking for practical guidance. He's looking for application. So I encourage you to read the Bible. If you've not done it, start. Make a commitment this morning that 1 year from now, you will have read through the Bible from cover to cover. Again, 10 to 12 minutes, 3.2 chapters, lots of apps, lots of Bible apps that'll read it to you. Really good thing to do. And so I'll close with this final verse. It's a passage from Joshua 1. Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, God gives us this promise. He says, constantly think about my word every day and every night, so you'll be sure to obey it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. I would argue that that's why America has been prosperous and successful, because we applied more of the Bible than any other nation was applying at that time. And man, we have not been perfect, but I'll stack us up against any other nation at all. I have a lot of stuff that we have on lots of stuff. CRT, critical race theory, going through schools right now. Why didn't we teach that 30 years ago? Was it because we were a different nation 30 years? No, it's because we knew too much history 30 years ago. Do you know that in the American Revolution, every battle in the American War for Independence was an integrated battle, black and white? The average black soldier re-enlisted and served 9 times longer than the average white soldier did. As a matter of fact, I can take you through scores of the heroes of the American Revolution. George Washington in Lafayette said we wouldn't have won the Revolution if it hadn't been for James Armistead, a black double spy, first double spy in American history. You got the commander-in-chief saying he's the dude that wins the war for us. We've never even heard of him today. Do you know the first black elected to office in America was 1641? Do you know when the first black was elected to office in Great Britain? 1987. You know when the first black was elected to office in Russia? 2010. I'll put us up against any other nation. And yes, we've done plenty of bad stuff. We've got the good, bad, ugly, but we've got more good than we've got bad and ugly. We just don't know any of it. And that's what we have to get back to. So again, I think we've been successful because we've used God's word more than any other nation. And every time we've got it wrong, it's been the word that's brought us back. It was preachers in the church that got the abolition movement going, that got the Underground Railroad going. All the times we got it wrong, it was the church that brought us back. So without a knowledge of God's word, it's hard to get over the things that will trip nations up. So I encourage you, get into God's word. If this is new history to you, I would send you, we have a table outside. There's a book there called The American Story, which goes through a whole lot of the stuff, including a lot of the black heroes we no longer hear about, but it just goes through history. And if you're interested in the Bible verses that shaped America, Founders Bible will go through like what John Adams said about Jeremiah 17:9. You can look up that verse and see how they said that shaped our government. So there's a lot there, but get into the Bible, get into God's word. That's what starts tomorrow with VBS. These kids have a chance to get into it, see our history, see our heritage, and see God's word. It's a really good thing to get into. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.